Hi, my name is Janice McWhertor, and I am your teacher for this week, and we're doing Lesson 5, James 3, 1 through 12. And the title, which is very important to remember, is On Preventing Forest Fires. So we'll start with me reading this passage. So James 3, 1 through 12. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species. But no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of poison. With it, we bless the Lord and Father, and with it, we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. This is the word of God. So we start this with the subject of teachers. And James says that not many of us should become teachers. So I have to say from the start, it feels ironic to be the teaching leader this week and to start with this caution from James. Now, teaching is usually a respected vocation. Teachers are in a position of authority. Teachers can have a profound influence for good and evil on their students from their position of authority. And because of this, James says, anyone who teaches will also be judged, held to a higher standard than those who do not teach. But, says James, even the pressure of a higher standard to bear, a teacher will make mistakes. A teacher cannot be perfect. There is a humility to learn in being a good teacher. And for James, humility is a trait that we must examine, we must search out, and we must cultivate. Now, when you ponder the people in your life who you remember as good teachers, what qualities stand out? It is probably not just their knowledge. There is probably a long list of good, godly traits, right? And I wonder if humility isn't one of them. James does not develop this theme of teachers very much in this section. The theme he does develop, though, is humility. James has been implicitly and explicitly helping us think about humility and the underside of humility, arrogance, already throughout chapters 1 and 2. Now, the role of teachers is going to be developed later, but what we can think about now is that people who are in authority, such as teachers, are particularly in danger of spiritual arrogance, a lack of humility, and words are usually the way that we express that arrogance. A teacher should teach what is true and then live up to what is taught, right? And yet James reminds us here that there is going to be failure for all of us, judgment and failure. What a dilemma that he puts before us. But then James applies this dilemma for teachers to the specific subject of the tongue. The tongue, right? We all know. Is there any of us here who has never gotten in trouble because of his or her tongue? If I could bridle my tongue, I could gain a lot of control over my whole self. If I think of my tongue as the rudder of a ship, I could lead myself into calm and refreshing waters, away from danger and tumult that would be caused by my tongue. A little bit of steering can go a long way. But James says the tongue is like a spark. It can set the whole forest ablaze. Verse 6, the tongue is a fire. It stains the whole body. It sets on fire the cycle of nature and is itself set on fire by hell. That's strong. With our tongue, one act of evil can spread so much destruction. Be hateful with our tongue, and we will be hateful in other aspects of our behavior. If I do not discipline and guide my speech, I will not discipline and guide every other area of my life. My gossip, my hurtful comments, and my slander will hurt the community, will stop the flow of God's mercy coming out through me, and will cut off my opportunity for good works. I'm going to say that again. My gossip, my hurtful comments, and my slander will hurt the community, will stop the flow of God's mercy coming from me, and will cut off my opportunity for good works. In other words, the direction of my life will be profoundly affected, shifted, and turned away from God. Verse 6 emphasizes this and says that thorough and far-reaching destruction is brought on by an uncontrolled tongue. Have you ever snapped at someone verbally? Well, if you're like me, you've done it countless times. While I was working on this passage, I had a very sad moment of awareness when I started to speak something that was going to be disrespectful to my granddaughter who I love. And as many of you know, because I do a lot of work on how racism and the effects of racism have damaged all of us, I had a moment of sorrow last week when my feelings, my ungodly feelings of white superiority toward my dear black friend wanted to come out as something that would have been hurtful. I wish it wouldn't happen, but I know that it does. Here at COS, we value words. We encourage our children to learn words. We speak words. We love words. We write words. I was thinking about myself this week on Zoom as I was talking to my 1-year-old grandson, Frankie, and I worked so hard to get him to say, Nana, and he did. James is using words to get our attention, right? He is not remaining silent, but he is definitely impressing on us the danger. Verse 5, how great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. We have certainly seen the damage of fires this year, and there's one raging right now in Colorado. Once a rumor is started, once a lie is retold, once a slander has been passed on, there is no way to stop it spreading. And the more well-known the leader, the bigger the fire of injustice is. The sight of a rapidly spreading fire must be terrifying. I have never seen that. And James has used this image to stir up the people, to move us to, I think, a swift and radical action. And in addition, if we find that the fire's source is unquenchable, it becomes even more sobering, doesn't it? Yet that's what James tells us. He seems to say that there is no hope in verse 8. We cannot bridle our tongue like a horse or keep the ship under control with a controlled tongue. Our tongues are hopelessly harmful. Verse 8 says, human beings cannot tame themselves. The tongue is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. James offers us a very harsh observation about ourselves in order to chasten us, in order to chasten the view we have of ourselves. Do we realize how vulnerable we are? Do we know how unstable our tongue is? Do we recognize the destruction it can cause? Can it inspire us to do something about it, to find a better way? This passage shows me the need to deeply lament, the need to confess. I wonder if this might mean we should all stop talking. It really does make me want to consider a vow of silence. That's how aware I am of how uncontrolled my tongue is. Martha Moore Keish, in her commentary, asks, but didn't the Christian church begin with tongues of fire in Acts 2? Fiery tongues are the beginning of the church, empowering people to speak to one another in different languages by the power of the Spirit. And the difference is this. At Pentecost, the real tongues of fire were sent by God, empowering to speak by the power of the Spirit of God. So some more questions emerge for us. Whose fiery tongues are inspiring us? Whose fiery tongues are we receiving? Whose fiery tongues are we repeating? In this passage, it's clear that James wants our attention. Our words need to be words that God speaks. Talk less. Listen more. Listen more to what God says. Judgment isn't mentioned here, really, but it is certainly implied. And I think this ties us right back to the dilemma of the teacher. This is not a superficial matter. So I think we need to be clear about what we are, our deep frailties, who we love, what we love. God never leads us to curse our neighbor, who is made in the image of God. Verse 9, How can it be that human beings who are good and made in the likeness of God and bless God can curse other humans who are also made in the likeness of God? My brothers and sisters, James laments, this ought not to be so. Praise and curse is unthinkable coming from the same mouth. Can we ever trust ourselves to speak? Well, we have to speak. We must speak. But speak godly words, words of love and mercy. We must feel compelled to be continually watchful, to keep a lid on the poison that we know has the power to destroy just with our tongues. This is sobering truth to comprehend and to contemplate. I do think about the verse we had in James 1, verse 19, where James says, it takes discipline to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And that leads me to think about our classic spiritual disciplines. When you think about it, every one of them has a focus on silence, solitude, prayer, self-examination, discernment, Sabbath keeping, fasting. We can't grow in our faith. We can't become more like Jesus if we cannot let Jesus discipline our tongue. In his book, The Way of the Heart by Henry Nouwen, he says, the most frequent argument for silence is simply that words lead to sin. Not speaking, therefore, is the most obvious way to stay away from sin. The connection is clearly expressed by the Apostle James. And James leaves little doubt that speaking without sinning is difficult. Thus, silence became one of the central disciplines of the spiritual life. To treat people with contempt is to treat God's own greatness, who God is, with contempt. The implications are huge, aren't they? Just and honorable treatment for all is the call that God has put on every one of us. And so this would include everybody, right? The sick, the elderly, the poor, the rich, the ones we like, the ones we don't like, the obnoxious, the cheater, the persecutor, the unjust leader, and on and on. How can we sing praises to God and then abuse people? Any people, all people, by ridicule, insults, and attacks. So think within the church, using the image from verse 10. When have we seen blessing the Lord and cursing of someone? Think within ourselves. When do we bless the Lord and then turn around and curse a person? For me, there is another direct application of this passage, and it comes in the form of our current presidential campaign. My critique moves dangerously close to cursing. And again, I think James wants me to be horrified by this and unwilling to accept this about myself. I think James wants me to grieve, to lament, to ask for forgiveness when I see these contradictions between my faith and my words. Is my faith true? Is it authentic? For like springs of water, fig trees, grapevines, and olive trees, we will produce according to our nature. Good fruit, a controlled tongue, is evidence of genuine faith in Christ. And I think about Matthew 12 here as our ending. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Will you pray with me? Dear Lord, I think of another familiar passage in Psalm 19. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. One of the songs that I thought of that goes very well with what we've been doing is Psalm 130, and we sang it in our liturgy this past Sunday. And I'm going to just read one of the verses. Out of the depths I cry, Lord, O Lord, please hear my call. Let your ears be attentive. I beg for mercy, Lord. If you marked our offenses, O Lord, who then could stand? But you grant us forgiveness, therefore we stand in awe. My hope is in the Lord's word. For the Lord I wait more eagerly than watchmen yearn for the morning light. Hope in the Lord, O people, in his unfailing love. With him is full redemption. He will redeem his own. May it be so. Thanks.